Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Argus by the band Wishbone Ash.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
As you might have noticed, this is episode 200 of 365 Days of Prog. I can't believe we reached this milestone. This is amazing. I never thought I could do it, but with the help of all of you coming and watching these videos, leaving your comments and showing your support, this has been made possible and I get the energies to continue this day by day. And you know, seeing as we've reached episode 200, I'm beginning to see the end of this series. Now, I have a lot of plans for what is to come at the end of the year, but if there's one thing that I know is that I'm gonna make a very interesting, very, well-made, conclusive video for the entire series. And usually when I make these videos, besides the countless hours I put into this, I don't have any expenses making these videos besides the pens and the notebooks that I use to write my reviews, and currently my 2 Patreon backers are covering that up quite finely. But that last video that I'm gonna make is gonna cost me quite a bit more than that. Let's say not too much, but it's gonna cost me a bit. So I'm gonna ask this, although I don't usually do it, if anyone here is watching this video and you're enjoying the series and you want to help me create something really special to cap this all off, then I highly suggest that you go ahead and check out my Patreon. We have a goal on there right now, and if we reach that goal, you'll know that you've helped me in achieving the amount of funding that I need in order to create that very special video. But again, I don't want this video to focus too much on money. If you can't support it, it's fine. Watching these videos is enough support as it is, and I'm so grateful for 200 episodes, and come on, we can do it. Let's reach the 300 episode mark. But for now, here are some of my favorite bits from today's album. So maybe needless to say, I will tell you all that today's album didn't just find its place on the 200th spot on the album, I actually put it there myself. And my reasoning for it was as follows. This album, it is one of the higher rated albums when it comes to the prog related subgenre. Well, you might not actually call this one a subgenre of prog because it's technically just albums that are related to prog but couldn't quite be justified to be prog themselves. But this album is ranked at number 8 in the prog related subgenre alongside albums such as Led Zeppelin 4 or even Night at the Opera by Queen, so it's very much up there. But it seems like whenever you go ahead and search out interesting progressive rock albums, you'd find this album popping out time and time again. So I asked myself the question, why is this album considered to be prog related? And then I looked at the band who made it, called Wishbone Ash, and realized that these guys, well, despite having a pretty progressive beginning with their first 3 albums, they couldn't quite be considered progressive at all when it comes to the albums they released after that. These guys, they're just maniacs. They've released so many albums, they never stopped releasing albums up until like this very day. So in each and every decade since their formation back in the 70s, they released at least 4 or even 5 studio albums, which is like unheard of, and apparently their music thus far has been mostly dominated by just guitar works and basic rock grooves. And you probably wouldn't be surprised to see that most of their albums aren't that highly rated on the prog archives, unlike the one that we are reviewing today called Argus, which has a rating, a very fine rating if I might add, of 4.24 out of 5 stars. And this album on its surface seems to be quite a concept album, but apparently it just isn't. Despite the cover having some very strong imagery on it that is also carried away by the titles of the songs found on this album, it is surprising to me to say that this is actually not a concept album but just an album which somehow has a loose idea around it. And personally, in some sense, I do believe that this album could have benefited actually from having a concept. And this kind of leads me up to my next point, which is that this album was pretty much a slap in the face for me, and I was sitting there and thinking to myself, am I listening to the right album right now? Like, this album really stands high up there with Robert Wyatt's Rock Bottom in the category of albums that I'm not quite sure that I'm actually listening to what everyone else is talking about. And if I wasn't clear enough about my opinions of this album by now, I was blown away by it in the other direction. I was like blown back by it because I thought that this was gonna be a hidden gem of prog from an overall not progressive band, and I thought that this was gonna be something to blow me away that I would love forever, because every single person that I saw reviewing this album basically had that to say about it. But what I ended up finding is a pretty much basic rock album with 2 leading guitars, which is maybe the most special thing about it, but that's about it. It had the simple rock grooves and it just, you know, rocked its way forward, and as a rock album it's fine, but as a prog album, well, it isn't quite so. And you know, that's the catch. That's exactly the catch. What I was just referring to are the 2 double guitars to be found on this album. For some reason, everyone that has reviewed this album ever has always said how they melted away at the sound of the 2 guitars simultaneously playing the melodies and the counter melodies and, you know, I don't know, syncopation, whatever. Let's just throw out terms all away because I really don't get what people are so excited about it. I really don't get what people are so excited about. They talk about this album as if the playing on it is just exquisite and nothing like this has been ever heard and this is just groundbreaking, when in actuality, I really couldn't see none of that. You know, just 2 days ago we reviewed 14 Octaves, and that album, of course, its concept was that it had 14 octaves, meaning 2 pianos being played simultaneously, and that album, well, it had something to be proud of because it did actually make excellent use of both pianos going at once in various interchanges, and that's pretty nice. But this album, as I said, the 2 guitars really don't do that well in creating the desired effect of what might be achieved with 2 guitars playing simultaneously. And you know, it's not like it's something unheard of. We get a lot of albums with even more than 2 guitars which make an excellent use of that. I remember Caligula's Horse by Bloom, which was an amazing album that made the use of just that. But in this case, I don't know, maybe it was groundbreaking back in the day when this one came out, but in all honesty, I really don't see that. So for just a bit of context, I think that a lot of this album sounds a bit like Freebird by Lynyrd Skynyrd. Now, despite the fact that Freebird actually came out a year later after this one, I still think that you can state the similarities and see which one did it better. There's a lot of similarities between the two, and of course Freebird by Lynyrd Skynyrd uses also 2 guitars simultaneously for a very interesting effect, sometimes playing the same riff and making it more grandiose, and sometimes playing something different and creating this dissonance, which is also pretty cool. And it seems like this album by Wishbone Ash could have had the same potential, but they just really didn't utilize it quite well, and I am still baffled to see why people love this so much and praise this technique so much on this album. Of course, for everyone in the comments, you have a lot of explanations to do. I'm sure that some of you really like this album, although sometimes I am surprised to see that a lot of you just, you know, agree with me on these things, and we're just, you know, this tiny split of the community. We are the silent majority, unlike the very vocal minority that I've read their reviews throughout the research for this album. And speaking about other artists, besides sounding a lot like Lynyrd Skynyrd, I believe that this album also had some pretty interesting points that sounded like songs like Carry On or Woodstock from Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young album Deja Vu. Now, I'm saying all of this just to show you that this is no new grounds they're showing here. I tried to find an explanation to why this album is so highly popularized, but I just couldn't. I tried tried thinking about what groundbreaking things they did, and I couldn't come up with anything because this album, it didn't come out in like the 60s, it came out in 1972. A lot of things were done by then, a lot of groundbreaking albums already came out, and when it comes to progressive music, I even doubt that you can really call this progressive and actually praise it for its progginess. Most of what Wishbone Ash are creating here is basic American rock. Now here's the punchline. These guys, they're not American, they're actually British, and that's like the funniest thing ever. Even like as British people, they are making American rock and it just is very basic. And you know what, that might be the only reasoning for why this album was so groundbreaking maybe to so many people. Maybe Wishbone Ash, they introduced the American rock into like the UK at the time, although I couldn't really find any concrete evidence to say that. So again, I'm gonna base a lot of my corrections on you guys in the comments, seeing what you have to say about this one. So to summarize things up, here are my negatives for this album, and I am mainly gonna pinpoint them down. So the first thing is, of course, making longer the usual songs and thinking that that consists as progressive music when in actuality it just doesn't. And secondly is that this album sounds like a very interesting proto-prog album, despite the fact that it didn't come out in the 60s even. It came out in a very flourishing time for prog. And the last thing is having John Tout of Renaissance on keyboards on the last track and completely underutilizing him. I don't get why they did this. Like, they had one of the most talented keyboard players I've ever heard in my life, and he just doesn't do anything on that song, and that was a big disappointment. The upsides for this album are pretty narrowed down, but the bass line on Sometime World is just fantastic. I really enjoyed it. The cymbals being played on Warrior are also pretty cool. I really like the atmospheric vibe they give off, and personally my favorite song on here was actually Leaf and Stream. I really can't tell you why. It's pretty different from the rest, and I guess that's why I liked it. It's not a perfect song, and technically I rated it much the same as all the others, and I don't know, I think it's my favorite, and that's like a bit of an upside. But on the flip side, not judging this album as a prog album, this one would be quite highly rated. It is pretty good rock and it's pretty fun to listen to, but I couldn't quite connect to it personally, and I think that I did have some high expectations to it that were definitely not fulfilled. I can see myself spinning this one around once in a blue moon, but just with the right company and mostly as background music. But all in all, I guess my Wishbone Ash isn't a bad album, and I think the fault for my reception of it is definitely coming from the community and not the band themselves. The band have put together a very interesting album, although not very progressive in its essence, but the reputation given to it by the community throughout the years has made me somewhat believe that this was a masterpiece of prog by a non-progressive band, but I was let down by it, and you know what, I'll think about it in the future when I get really high expectations of albums that I honestly probably shouldn't have any towards. Well, at least I can talk some good about this album, and that's in the form of its cover given to us by probably what is the best studio for album cover art in the progressive scene, and that's of course Studio Hypnosis. So the cover itself, it is pretty simple. You have a soldier looking like a Roman soldier, but it might as well be a medieval soldier, I actually don't know, and he's standing with his back to the camera and looming over the mountainous landscapes of France and looking at a UFO in the sky. UFO? Wait, what UFO? So for anyone watching this video right now and might actually own a copy of this one in CD form or in vinyl form, I suggest that you pause this video right now, go ahead, get your copy, and come back and answer a simple question. On the back cover of this one, do you see a UFO in the sky? And well, you'll see the answer for that question is actually not conclusive at all. So I'll show you here on the side this back cover of the album, and if you look closely, well, you'll see a pretty bright UFO floating right there in the sky. But if I shift it out and I'll show you the full cover for this album, if you look again, it'll be quite hard for you to find that same UFO, and the reason for it is because it's not there. So what happened here? What do we have here? Why is there a UFO that is missing from this cover but is also present on it? What's going on with the Schrödinger UFO? Well, the reasoning for it is quite interesting. So apparently on the original vinyl release of this album, the soldier himself was actually looking at a flying saucer in the sky. But apparently when a CD reissue of this album was made in 2002, someone in the studio room or the designer room decided to airbrush the UFO out of the cover. I don't know why, they just did. But the funny thing about it, when a reissue in 2007 was made, a double CD one, they actually reintroduced the UFO. So now that you know that, and if you have a copy of this album, you can check out to see if I'm right or wrong, and seeing whether you do have or don't have the infamous flying object in the sky. But all in all, with the UFO or with not, I think that this is a really cool cover. I know that the UFO kind of changes the idea and turning something very interesting but also very realistic into something sort of sci-fi-ish, but again, I love this one for the composition, the imagery, the colors, and the way they made this one. It is just fantastic. There is a bunch of interesting lore about who is the person that's acting out the soldier, and that's an interesting thing that I decided not to include here, but if you're interested, you can also search it up online. So this album, as I said, I wasn't too interested in it. It's not that interesting, it just is a rock album. If I were to judge it by its own merit as just a simple rock album, I would have given it a rating of 7, but unfortunately, as this is 365 Days of Prog, I'm gonna give it a pretty underwhelming score for a 200th episode, and that's a score of 6 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. We're gonna start off the next 100 episodes with a pretty solid album, at least I do hope so, and this one is a very cool one, and it's called If I Could Do It All Over Again, I'd Do It All Over You, by a band which we have visited quite recently actually, and these are of course Caravan. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wallenham and Wrist of Kings, you are the best. And of course, if anyone wants to help me creating this conclusive project of mine, you can always go ahead and check out the Patreon right now. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.